May 15th, 2023, Savannah. A graduate seminar gathers in a quiet reading room at the Georgia Historical Society. Blinds half drawn against coastal glare, air steady with the hum of a dehumidifier. On the cart sits a family Bible bound in cracked calfskin. Between Ecclesiastes and the Gospel of John, a camellia lies pressed thin as paper, its petals browned by time and freckled with a faint circular stain like the ghost of a teacup. The curator notes silvery granules in the gutter of the page and sweeps them into a vial for elemental analysis. In the photographs that follow, the camellia becomes a charged image. Grief flattened into a record, a flower-turned ledger, a witness that survived the century. The world that grew that flower had once been a grid of squares, iron balconies and live oaks that fenced the Atlantic wind with Spanish moss. In the late spring of 1858, the Hale townhouse faced a brick lane off Oglethorpe Avenue, its street side draped in mourning crepe, its shutters closed to the noon heat, its steps brushed every morning by a housemaid named Clara Riley. The Hale business was rice, with fields to the south and papers kept in a counting room behind the parlor. In town, the house ran on ritual and surveillance. Keys clinked on a ring at the belt of the steward. Lamps were trimmed at dawn and again at dusk. The pantry lock rusted along the hasp, oiled once a week. Every movement indoors left a small sound. Bucket on tile, poker in grate, broom bristles scoring pine. The city had its own routine of watchfulness. Guards paced Bay Street at night with lanterns that threw steady discs on cobbles. A church bell at St. John's marked the quarter hours across the squares. Women in crepe visited the bereaved according to a social calendar printed in the newspaper and repeated by coachmen, laundresses, and the woman who kept the milliner's bill book. Morning visits lasted the length of a cup. Tea meant condolences completed. Clara's work pivoted on the kettle and the tray. She knew water by sound, when it turned from whisper to breath. She knew the way tannin deepened with each minute and how steam held the perfume of a dried blossom if the lid was lifted at the right moment. The house held a tin of rat powder in the back of the pantry, labeled in a hand that did not expect house servants to read. She had learned letters piecemeal from a child's primer once left on a stair, and she had learned measures by sight: pinch, half pinch, a grain, a dusting on a knife's tip. She was quick with a cloth and slower with her thoughts when slowness kept her safe. Each dawn before the others woke, she stood under the fig tree in the yard and pressed her thumb to its skin to feel what the birds had done overnight. She took comfort in the fig's habits, the way it kept returning sap where a branch had been cut. The harm that blew the surface smooth and cold had arrived months earlier when the Hale cousin, Prior Hale, came inland from the fields with a red ledger and a pocketful of promissory notes. The man was older than the master by a year and watched everything with the narrow gaze of someone who had memorized the price of flour and the weight of a shilling. He carried the smell of smoke in his clothes even when not near a stove. The master died within a season after that, a fever that turned and did not turn back, and the house was draped in black while the cousin settled accounts in the counting room. Clara's brother had been hired out as a porter at the riverfront. The cousin closed that income, then arranged a sail downriver with a trader who left before dawn. There was no plea and no return, only a space on the pallet and a pair of worn shoes under the bed frame. The emptiness moved inside her like a tide. From that moment, her hands worked as before, while her mind counted differently. Names not dishes, insignias not ingredients, faces not floors. Injury taught a new arithmetic. The antagonists of her landscape organized themselves the way furniture arranged a room. Prior Hale ran the figures, and his vice was the quiet gamble, not in cards, but in estates. He borrowed against the next year as if it were a cupboard to be emptied. Control was a habit he fed by tightening clocks and shortening lists. His weakness lay in vanity. He liked patterns that looked like order, even when they hid a collapse. Evangeline Hale, the widow, breathed etiquette as if it were air. Her vice was appearance. She counted condolences like coins and organized her grief by degrees of ribbon. She controlled by language, by the way a refusal could sound like a favor. The crack in her method was fatigue. Lack of sleep loosened the lines at the corner of her eye and made her careless with papers. Mr. Thorne, the steward, kept the keys and the cellar drawings. He was a man who spoke with the movement of his hands, the small authority of the ring at his belt, the swing of a door just wide enough to signal who might pass. His vice was fear. He controlled through petty delay, preferring to have others wait while he unlocked something slowly. His weakness was predictability. His afternoon route never changed. Mr. Lemaire, the apothecary on Broughton, sold laudanum in brown glass and powders in paper cones. His vice was profit. He covered it with the language of science, dosing drops in a glass cylinder. He controlled by limited access, selling at hours that suited him. The break in his wall was greed. A tip made him talkative, and a busy shop made him careless with change. The press that bound all of them was the ledger, the way entries turned people into rows and rows into obligations. When the widow's mourning began, Pryor found a use for the visits. Tea would be poured, condolences arranged in a sequence of cups, and a signature would follow. Sometimes a bequest required a witness. Sometimes a debt could be turned into equity with the stroke of a pen. Widow's tea was hospitality and instrument in the same breath. Clara studied the house the way a navigator studies tides. The kettle was a constant. The pantry cabinet door held a rust hook that squealed when opened in haste. The decanter in the sideboard had a nick on the lip. Liquid poured more quickly from that edge. The tin of rat powder shed a faint metallic glitter if tapped against a spoon. In the family Bible, pressed flowers lay like pressed hours, placed there by Evangeline with a movement that signaled memory and display. Each bloom corresponded to a funeral wreath, and each insertion went beside an entry in the genealogy. Clara watched the ritual and learned its rhythm. Flower, name, date, a closing of the book. Her private ritual took shape in response. She saved a spoon with a worn bowl and a scratch near the stem. It looked like all the others, but in candlelight the scratch caught and held. She cleaned teapots until the inside glowed, and then left, by design, a small dark ring under the spout of one. The ring that would appear in the photograph a century and more later. She borrowed, for brief minutes, the Bible when the parlor was empty, pressed a second flower alongside the first, then made a pinprick in the margin with a needle from the work basket. One prick meant a condolence visit that ended in a fainting. 2 meant a visit that ended with a carriage called abruptly. 3 meant a funeral to follow. When the Bible closed, her hand moved to the fig tree, where she buried scraps of paper cones with powder residue. The tree kept her secrets in its roots. The house's surveillance was thorough and also flawed. Children crossed spaces, adults ignored. A boy named Lewis carried calling cards from the hallway table to the parlor tray. He watched hands more than faces, and could tell by fingers alone who was a ring wearer and who was not. A neighbor's cat lazed on the staircase landing and tracked the heat from the kitchen with its ears. Its presence made the mice move differently, and the rat powder took effect faster when the mice were unsteady. A watchman on the square favored the southwestern corner after dusk because the wind off the river was gentler there. His route left a thin shadow in a window at the same time each evening. These patterns helped shape what could be done and when. That spring, the social calendar listed several mornings set aside for receiving. The first was for the widow. the second for the matriarch of a neighboring family, the third for a cousin whose husband had died in a canal accident. The press of custom wrote itself into the household tasks. Clara carried coal scuttles, filled the urn, polished the silver tongs, folded napkins into shapes that would hold the biscuits upright. She rehearsed the distance from kettle to tray, the time from steep to strain, the second at which milk clouded the liquid and sugar dulled the brightness. She counted breaths. She planned the position of the spoon, with the scratch on the tray's right edge, to be chosen more easily by a distracted hand. Her motive took on edges. It was not rage that guided her, nor a wish for spectacle. It was a vector pointed at one man and the system that sheltered him. The cousin had used the tea table as a desk. His signatures followed cups. Clara's plan would reverse that order. Tea would move before the pen, and the pen would commit the fatal patterns to paper afterward. She would make the house record its own harm. The first step was small and practiced. Carry the tray to the parlor when the bell rang, pour without spill, lift with the wrist, lower with the eye, and count the heartbeats it took for courtesy to settle into the room. She seeded the ground because that is how cautious work begins. The spoon with the scratch stayed near the cup set for the closest kin. The teapot with the faint ring under its lip found its way to the top of the stack so it would be chosen on days when the receiving line stretched from hall to stoop. The Bible's pressed flowers multiplied in pairs, and the needle pricks in the margins matched the measured accidents that followed. A small packet of powder lived in the hem of her skirt, stitched in a place where fingers could reach without a glance. The decoy key ring in the kitchen, an old ring hung with broken keys, sat where Mr. Thorne could see it and feel reassured that the pantry was secured when it was not. Under the fig, a shallow jar held scraps of paper where powder dust had caught, covered by soil and leaf litter, the mouth wrapped in oilcloth to keep out rain. When the first of the widow's teas arrived, the storm flags at the harbor were quiet, and the day smelled of cut grass. The parlor curtains made the air dim and soft. Visitors brought their sorrow like a garment they would remove once they crossed the threshold. In the kitchen, the kettle trembled. The tin shed its glitter and then disappeared into the seam of Clara's skirt. From the square came the measured sound that would carry through the acts to come. The bell of St. John's striking the hour, a brass heartbeat that ordered the trays, the steps, the signatures. The bell marked time in the house and on the page. Inside the Bible, the camellia pressed among the names held the touch of a teacup on its browning petal, a mark that would, more than a century later, pull a researcher's eye toward a pattern and an argument. In the shadow of the fig tree, roots thickened, and in the counting room the red ledger waited for its next entry. Clara moved between heat and paper, between kettle and book, between harm and record. Outside, the city adjusted itself to the routine of grief, and the decoy ring of keys winked harmlessly on a hook near the pantry door. On that morning, just as the door knocker sounded and carriage wheels scraped the curb, the bell on the square tolled the hour again, its echo reaching the kitchen a breath late. It might have been a call to ritual or a warning. For Clara, it became a ticking signal, a metronome for a sequence that would be both domestic and catastrophic. The plan did not yet name itself as a plan. It lived in the muscle and the margin, in a scratched spoon and a pressed flower, in a book that watched the house without eyes. The plan formed where heat met habit. In the kitchen, the kettle sang a narrow note just before boil, and that was where Clara measured. The rat powder in its tin shimmered when the lid shifted. A knife's edge could lift what the eye barely registered. She learned that steam carried scent upward while heaviness drifted down the spout. A dusting brushed along the inner lip would travel with the first pour and cling to glaze where the stream thinned. Sugar hid bitterness. Milk softened edges and bent suspicion toward the dairy. She rehearsed in silence, moving spoon to cup, cup to saucer, saucer to tray, tray to parlor, each transfer small enough to escape notice and large enough to shape an afternoon. The first set piece arrived on the mourning day for the widow. The day was still, the kind that made paper stick to a palm and shutters tap in a slow rhythm. Clara had placed the pot with the faint ring at the top of the stack and kept the scratched spoon to the right rear of the tray. The parlor curtains sighed when the front door opened, and a length of crepe brushed the threshold. In the kitchen, she counted breathing, lifted the lid, touched the tin to the knife, and returned the tin to a shaded corner where the cat's tail could not sweep it. The dose was not a heap. It was a thought made visible only under candlelight. The first pour carried a thread of glitter to the cup set closest to the chair Pryor favored during condolence calls. The objective was simple: let courtesy run its course while the counting room waited. Consequences came as they often do, slowly and then all at once. The guest sipped, the spoon clinked, the tray went back, and the counting room door remained ajar. Within an hour, a face paled and a hand rested on an arm of a chair longer than comfort allowed. Mr. Lemaire's laudanum found its way into a glass and dulled the complaint to a drowse. That afternoon, the Bible received another bloom pressed beside a line of names, and in the margin, a single pinprick marked the corner. In the counting room, Pryor wrote a neat line that converted a debt to an interest against a parcel upriver. Cup, flour, entry, heat, hand, record. The day set a pattern without speaking its name. The second set piece took place not in the parlor, but in the corridor that connected pantry to hall. Mr. Thorne, rattled by household whispers, decided the pantry needed a change. He removed the tin, wiped its lid, and locked it behind a cedar door whose key did not live on the decoy ring. He began to taste from the spout before trays left the kitchen, a small show of vigilance that nearly undid the working. For a moment, the plan stuttered. Clara could not reach the locked shelf without both the right key and an open corridor. Her hands paused over clean cups while her mind searched the yard. The fig tree offered what the house refused. Beneath it, the shallow jar held paper scraps dusted by earlier cones. She fetched it at dawn under the pretext of shaking a rug, and lifted the oilcloth with her back to the windows. The residue inside had caked into tiny scales, dull until turned to the sun. She ground them between finger and thumb against a shard of china, returned the pieces to a folded napkin, and slid the napkin into her skirt hem where a seam had been loosened and resewn with thread the color of shadow. That afternoon, when Mr. Thorne stood with his cup at the ready for tasting, Clara tilted the pot toward him first, let the first stream go harmless onto his palm and into the basin, then refilled the pot with fresh water while he waited, satisfied at the theater of caution. Only when his back turned did she touch the napkin to the inner lip, brushing the faintest line along the glaze. The adaptation held. The pantry remained locked. The decoy keys kept their harmless shine, and the tray went out when the bell on the square tolled. Forensic traces multiplied where no one thought to look. The scratched spoon left a constant in a changing room. It returned to the same corner of the tray even after washing because Clara dried it last and set it slightly apart to mark it by muscle memory. The teapot's underlip ring left tiny crescents on the inner rim of cups that took the first pour. Later, when rinsed, those crescents caught at cloth and left a faint metallic glint that a launderess would note only as stubbornness. Sugar lumps in the silver bowl developed small pits where tongs had crushed them after the powder settled. To an apothecary, those pits would read as contact. To a guest, they read as clumsy hands. In the Bible, a second pinprick joined the first beside the camellia, and a thin dust caught in the paper fibers where the petal's edge met the margin. The act of pressing sealed what the air might otherwise carry away. The third set piece unfolded in the apothecary's shop itself. The house sent Clara for tinctures to calm the widow's sleep and for rat scourings to dissuade mice emboldened by an idle watchman. The shop smelled of spirits and fennel. Glass chimed against glass in the back when Mr. Lemaire measured. His scale was clean, and he was careful where others could see. When the shop filled, his carefulness blurred. A boy with a swollen cheek climbed on a stool. A woman in a bonnet unfolded a list. A sailor paid with coins too tarnished to please anyone. Mr. Lemaire wrapped paper cones and tied them with twine. One cone slipped from the counter to the floor and burst a little, leaving a shine on the blackwash. Clara stood with her purchases and watched which rag he used to swipe the crumbs into a bucket. When his attention moved elsewhere, she stepped so the hem of her skirt brushed the floor's faint shimmer and caught some of what the rag missed. That night she rinsed the hem in a basin and poured the water into the yard where the fig would drink. The jar's stores rose by a breath. The plan's stores rose with them. Community logistics supported and threatened the work in equal measure. Lewis carried cards between rooms and saw more than his height suggested. He learned the sequence of arrivals and timed Clara's steps with a nod that could be read as politeness. The watchman on the southwestern corner shifted to the opposite side of the square when a wind change made the river's breath too damp. That change shortened the shadow that reached the kitchen window and moved Clara's preparation earlier by a few beats. The neighbor's cat, moved by unseen currents, began sleeping near the pantry door, forcing Clara to take a wider path that creaked a board in the hall. Each adjustment was small and mattered. The fourth set piece tightened the rope. A solicitor came to witness a deed connected to a canal share. Pryor favored the straightback chair near the mahogany table by the window, the one that set his seal where the light fell strongest. Clara placed a tray with the familiar order and tucked the scratched spoon into the fold of a napkin closest to the chair. The objective here was not collapse in the parlor. It was erosion. A solicitor who left with a hand tremor would return home with a stomach uneasy and lie down in a room where servants could testify later about clamminess and pain. The consequence would break in private, but record in public, because signatures would predate sickness by a narrow span. When the cup returned to the tray, a ring of liquid had dried at its base, and on the table near Pryor's elbow, a brown circle the size of a coin marred the gloss. The counting room ledger that evening contained a line that gave Pryor temporary management over the canal share pending full probate. The Bible later received a pressed blossom with the third, near-invisible prick. The story threaded itself without voices. A counter move arrived with weather. A sea breeze thickened by late day built a line of thunderheads to the south. The first strike of lightning brought a sudden decision among the callers. Coffee would be taken instead of tea to fortify nerves. The kitchen reeled because pots for coffee lived in a higher cabinet, and the grind demanded time the bell did not allow. Clara adapted with craft born from watching men in kitchens she would never own. She took the milk jug that had not seen powder and kept it that way. She kept the coffee clean, bright, and bitter, and she returned to tea at the very end for those with gentler stomachs. The dusting went only to the final cups. The change of order masked intention. One guest left steadier, another left with a mild complaint, and a third, young and sensitive, grew quiet and glassy-eyed before the storm reached its height. The kitchen felt the thunder as a shaking spoon in a drawer. The parlor felt it as a tremor under chairs. The pressed flour for that day wore a rain mark from a drop that fell when a window latch failed. It browned in the Bible beside the pricks like a cloud trapped on the page. Clara's procedural flaw came on a late afternoon when the house smelled of starch and coal smoke. In the rush of a second receiving line, she set down 2 trays, one for the adults and one for children sent with their elders because no one trusted streets that hummed with rumor. The scratched spoon slid by habit to the right rear of the wrong tray. A boy's hand reached, drawn by shine, and would have found more than sugar if not for the interchange of a sudden message from the hall. A carriage had pulled up with a wheel complaint, and children were shooed to the far room to look out at the street while men checked the axle. The pause allowed Clara to cross the trays, retrieve the spoon, and reset the order. Her breath returned in a measured line. The flaw left no mark but the memory of a board creaking under the extra step. By late summer, the pattern shifted from private incident to public murmur. Households compared notes at gates. A widow's circle narrowed its invitations. Doctors suspected climate, shellfish, grief. Rumor preferred cause that did not indict custom. Prior, impatient with fear he could not price, increased signatures between cups. The counting room filled with paper that moved land like chessmen. He did not see the way the Bible, tended by the widow's careful hand and Clara's silent code, mirrored his ledger line for line in its own terms. Flower beside name, pricks beside petal, dust sealed by weight. The book held a logic that would outlast him. The irreversible moment came on a day when light had the color of brass, and the bell at St. John's sounded thicker than usual in the heat. A matriarch whose name opened doors took her usual place by the window where cloth diffused glare. She left earlier than custom allowed, coat thrown across shoulders, lips pressed against comfort. She did not reach her door. Somewhere between squares, a servant half carried her to a settee and sent for help. The city learned in an hour what households had been whispering for weeks. Chairs scraped, schedules changed. In the Hale counting room, Pryor pressed his seal onto a transfer that granted him the right to manage a trust during the widow's seclusion. In the hallway, the tray sat briefly unattended before Clara carried it back, cup indentations marking where heat had been. She washed the pot until the ring under the lip only half showed and dried the scratched spoon with a cloth that would be boiled and wrung and boiled again. By nightfall, a line had been crossed that could not be recrossed. The watchman took a new path that put his lantern squarely in the kitchen window each quarter hour. Mr. Thorne began unlocking the pantry well before dawn and relocking it twice as often, a habit of nerves more than security. The apothecary sold out of laudanum, then of chalk. The widow lay in her room listening to footsteps interpret sorrow in hallways. The Bible remained on its table, open where air could do its quiet work. The fig tree's roots had taken what the basin gave and kept it. The house held its breath without being aware that it did so. Clara understood that, after the matriarch's collapse, the city's gaze would move to the household that hosted so much grief. She also understood that every remedy considered respectable would complicate her tool. Tasting by stewards, coffee over tea, windows open to disperse steam, new cups brought from a sideboard where glaze did not hold as well as the old, all of it would require adjustment. She stood in the kitchen that evening and traced the spout's line with a cloth, then folded the cloth to bury it in a hearth corner where ashes could make of it what they make of everything. The scraped jar went deeper under the fig, beneath a stone whose weight her hands knew by heart. In the Bible, she placed a flower pressed by another hand, and with her needle she made the smallest prick yet, near the spine where only a careful reader would ever see. The bell tolled again. It sounded like a clock and like a summons. The city turned toward investigation without yet naming it. The cousin slept with papers near his pillow and a keyring under his hand that did not unlock what he thought it did. The servant boy dreamed of cups and a cat's still ears. The widow's breath caught and steadied. The plan had entered the phase where it would begin to right itself through other people's actions. The corridor smelled of tea and of a coming storm the sky had not yet declared. The stage was set for exposure because concealment had created too many small witnesses, each inanimate and faithful. A ring on a lip, a scratch on a spoon, a glitter sealed in the gutter of a holy book. The scene opened itself because the city could not ignore what it had begun to name. The matriarch's carriage did not finish its route, and the pathway between squares grew crowded with watchers. A boy fetched a doctor, a steward brought smelling salts, and a beadle from the church kept people back with gentle hands. The house that had poured the cup still smelled of tannin and coal. In the kitchen, a kettle cooled, its lid tipped to let out steam. On the tray, faint rings showed where porcelain had rested, while talk moved across fabric and grief. The first finder of meaning was not the doctor, nor the steward, but the child Lewis, who understood objects the way some men understood maps. He stood at the corridor's mouth and watched the light on a spoon's scratched neck, and the way the sugar in the bowl had small pits from tongs that pressed too hard after something dusted them. He did not speak it. He simply looked, and that look began a chain. The sheriff entered with a quiet authority on the morning after the collapse. He took into his possession what could hold a trace: the pot with the faint ring under its lip, the scratched spoon, the sugar bowl, the tin behind the pantry's locked door, and the ledger in the counting room that had gained so much ink in so few weeks. He wrote each item on a long sheet ruled in pale blue, and he asked that the family Bible be brought to the table because it lay open and had been handled often during condolence calls. The widow hesitated and then nodded. The Bible came forward like a guest asked to sit among strangers. The evidence told its own story in pieces. Under the teapot's lip, the sheriff's fingernail lifted a dull shine. On the rim of the cup that had sat nearest the favored chair, a faint crescent glinted where glaze had caught something heavier than tea. In the Bible's gutter near the pressed camellia, a light dust clung where a petal met the paper. The page showed a faint circular stain the size of a cup. The sheriff tapped the dust into a folded paper. He did not know the name of what he had, only that his work was to keep it from being lost. A coroner's inquest gathered in the courthouse chamber on a hot day in late summer. The room held long benches, a pale portrait of a governor, and shutters angled to blunt the sun. Fans moved in slow arcs. The coroner sat at a table with a green cloth and a glass of water that gathered sweat. A chemist from town, a man who kept a shop near the river and had a method for finding metals in traces, was sworn. His apparatus was simple to the eye: a glass tube, a lamp, a dish with acid, clean zinc, and a sheet of white card. He described a test that turned a hidden thing into a seen thing, a mirror on glass if the poison was the one he suspected. He asked for scrapings from the pot's lip and from the Bible page and from the inside of a cup. He set his lamp to a low blue. He fed the tube with the gas his mixture made. Where the flame licked the glass, a shadow grew into a faint, dark mirror along the curve. The chemist held up the tube. Men leaned in. They did not use the word that would become common in later years. They said arsenical and metal, and then, more carefully, malicious agency. The inquest called witnesses. The apothecary, Mr. Lemaire, arrived with his account book. He smelled of fennel and spirits and looked tired. He showed pages where powders and tinctures had been sold. Some entries were charged to the house, some to Prior Hale himself, when he had sent a boy with a written order to secure a finer grind of rat powder to be kept, as the note said, for a troubling season of vermin. Mr. Thorne spoke of locks and keys, and of his tasting from spouts when rumor grew. He showed the ring at his belt, and his hands trembled when he set it down because, in his house, keys meant safety, and safety had failed. The widow described social forms, careful to keep the edge out of her voice. She said tea was custom, that signatures followed condolence because business never wholly stopped. She bowed her head when the coroner asked whether she had pressed flowers into the Bible beside names. She said it was memory, and then she let her hands rest on the book's edge as if to keep it from floating away. Clara did not sit at the table. She moved in the corridor with a bucket and cloth, then stood quietly near the door when asked, and told the room about trays, kettles, steep times, and the way milk worked as a cloud to tame sharpness. She spoke of the scratched spoon only when the sheriff pointed to it, and said that it always found the same corner, a matter of routine more than intention. She said the pantry held a tin with a label, and that the steward kept it under lock since a few weeks past. She did not mention the jar under the fig. She kept her eyes on the floorboards where a certain board creaked if a person took too wide a step to avoid the sleeping cat. The coroner's jurors conferred. Their language bent around fear of public panic. Their first draft said visitation of God and exhaustion of the season. Their second said unwholesome infusion and misadventure. The chemist's mirror glinted on the table like a small moon, and the jurors changed their lines again. The verdict used careful words. Death by poison administered with intent by parties unknown. The unknown did not stay unknown for long, because men who moved paper for gain rarely escaped paper's return gate. The sheriff took Pryor's red ledger and set it side by side with the Bible. Where a flower had been pressed, an entry appeared in the ledger that signed away a share, or added a right to manage, or converted a loss into a temporary gain. Where the Bible's margin showed a tiny prick, a doctor's bill or a funeral notice followed. The two books mirrored each other across grief and ink. The press printed what it dared. The paper used words like T-fear, lamentable sequence, and singular concurrence. It avoided naming poison. It named Pryor because his name was already ink in public notices about bonds. A small square in the paper called for caution in the sale of rat powders and urged shopkeepers to enter the buyer's full name in their books. Another square, days later, reported a warrant. The sheriff kept his language formal and spare. He took Pryor into custody in the counting room where so many papers had begun. The seal and the pen were still on the table. The cousin looked like a man who had eaten little and slept less, and who did not yet grasp that a city can read a pattern long before a man who loves order can accept it. The trial opened in autumn in the same courthouse where the inquest had sat. The room smelled of pine and dust. The judge wore a sober coat, and the jury took their places with a gravity that matched the season. Euphemism covered the first hours. The words were malpractice of hospitality, improper administration, and felonious design. The chemist's tube came out again, and the mirror appeared as before. Mr. Lemaire's book showed dates and tallies, small cones of fine powder not all accounted for by the rat holes in the pantry. The steward spoke of keys. The child spoke of spoons and of how hands, when nervous, chose the bright scratch without knowing why. The widow kept her gaze forward and her gloves tight, and when the Bible was placed before the court, she placed her fingertips on the camellia and did not look away from what its browned petals meant. Circumstance became more than circumstance when a letter came to light. It was a short note locked in a desk in the counting room, written in Pryor's hand to the apothecary about a particular, refined powder for household pests to be set aside and collected by a servant without delay. The date sat inside the span when the matriarch had paid her condolences. The prosecution turned the paper so the jury could see the hand and the day. The defense spoke of vermin and of the season. The chemist's mirror lay between them, catching lamplight and turning it into a dark ribbon. The verdict came in a room that had grown hushed. The jury found the cousin guilty of murder by poison. The sentence was strict and of its time, carried out beyond the city gate on a morning that broke, pale and windless. The paper did not print details. It printed a sermon excerpt about the sin of hidden hands and a small notice about the widow's health. The city let the sound pass through it, and then settled into the shift that follows judgment. Caution, then policy, then custom hardened into rule. Clara's outcome was quieter. The day after the verdict, before dawn, she left the Hale house in a plain dress, carrying nothing that would catch an eye. She walked south along a lane that smelled of pluff mud and baked brick, and turned toward the marsh where small camps sometimes stood beyond the reach of quick questions. She did not return. Some said she took work on the islands where live oaks made shade enough to think. Others said she reached a maroon refuge along a creek run tight with reeds and stayed there, a name among friends and fireflies. The fig tree in the yard grew without her hand. The decoy keys hung for a while and then were put in a drawer. The city's legacy felt itself most clearly in kitchens. Teapots were scoured with new zeal. Spouts were rinsed to a hiss and then checked against light. Spoons were rotated and polished until no single piece could be told by a scratch. Sugar was kept in covered jars with lids that clanked when opened. Pantries gained new locks, and the keys were counted aloud at dawn and dusk. The sale of rat powder shifted under a careful eye. Clerks wrote out the buyer's name on slips and pressed them into books that sat beside the scale. People favored coffee when rumor flared, then drifted back to tea when talk cooled. The practice of pressing flowers into a Bible thinned. Some families banned it outright, saying a pressed bloom might carry more than memory. Others kept it and changed the place, moving the blossoms to blank pages where they would be only ornaments and not witnesses. Rumor took its own form. Children in the square played a game called Widow's Tea, in which one child poured and another pretended to faint, and then all laughed because that was how fear is handled by the very young. In parlors, women moved their cups with a new watchfulness. The phrase, "the widow's tea," became a way to mark any small ritual that might hide a larger design. Sailors told the story as a warning to men who thought themselves clever with paper. A song grew in lanes where cradle rock and work met, a soft chant about a flower that knew more than a man with a pen. Years turned. The Bible left the house when the line failed, and a collateral cousin inherited only furniture. In the reading room many years later, under careful light, the book opened again. The camellia lay the way it had been left in the last summer before the war. The petal still held the pale ring, and the gutter still held a dust that the curator lifted with a fine brush and tapped into a glass vial. The photograph showed what the city had learned to see: that domestic habit can be ledger, that paper can keep two kinds of books at once, and that a pressed bloom might outlast everything that tried to hide behind it. The final shape of the story did not flatter anyone. A cousin's hunger for paper gain met a woman's quiet reckoning with loss, and both found the city's slow, blunt balance in a room with shutters and fans. The apothecary kept his shop but learned to count differently. The steward lived on with his keys, less sure that metal cured fear. The widow sat at windows with a simpler tea and no callers for a long while. In one yard, a fig tree thickened, its roots tasting now and then a trace of something old in the dirt. The Bible stayed pressed in brown. What began as a tool of etiquette became an affidavit when the page met the chemist's lamp. In the reading room in late spring of a modern year, the graduate students finished their notes. The camellia gleamed in the photograph like a kept promise. The silvered granules in a vial told a quiet truth that fire could not burn and rain could not wash. The flower that once read as comfort now read as record. The house that trained its servants to be silent had kept, against its will, a witness that did not need a voice. The bell at St. John's, heard faintly through the glass, marked the hour as it always had. Its sound, long ago a metronome for trays and steps and signatures, now counted study and pause. The Bible closed with care. The image remained, a pressed bloom, a round stain, a thin dust that had once ridden steam, now part of history, exact as a ledger and soft as a petal.